The right to protest is enshrined in the Bill of Rights' First Amendment, and most Americans cherish it. Our textbooks and national lore celebrate moments in our history when individual and collective acts of civil disobedience, for example, the Boston Tea Party, seemed to change the course of history. We see protests as a part of civic life, indeed, as an international human right. The current national myth of the good protest is based on the Civil Rights Movement, CRM, that began with the Montgomery bus boycott in December 1955 and continued until Martin Luther King Jr.'s death in April 1968. Historians call this period the classical phase of a longer struggle. They recall orderly people who marched in the streets flying flags and holding signs, or took part in sit-ins practicing nonviolent passive resistance. Moreover, the CRM, as Americans like to remember it, simply sought to end legal segregation of the public sphere, which most people now agree was undemocratic. If a protest does not resemble the movement's classical phase demonstrations, critics often call it a usurpation of the nation's noble past. Many contrast protests of the 2010s and 2020s with those of the classical phase of the CRM to suggest that if they were more like those in the past, most Americans would readily support them now as they had then. For example, on September 4, 2020, New York Times columnist David Brooks argued that if Donald Trump tried to hold on to the presidency after losing the then upcoming election, citizens' protests should follow those of the classical phase. Pointing to their nonviolence and tight organization, he wrote, "That's how the movement captured the moral high ground and won the mind of the nation." He explained that, through epic acts of self-discipline, the nonviolent civil rights marchers in the 1960s forced their foes to reveal that if there were to be any violence and anarchy, it would come from the foes. That restraint, he implied, would win large-scale support today. That simplified myth of the good protest, and others like it, do the country a disservice. They shorten more than a century of diverse anti-racism protests to roughly a decade, implying that it was relatively easy to win total victory over racism, and also producing a national amnesia of the much longer struggle. They suggest that protesters should take action against only the most egregious state-sponsored laws, excluding a broader definition of racial justice and equity. Problematically, the myth holds subsequent demonstrations to a model of behavior that arose from a peculiar context at one moment in time. If protests do not conform to the orderly marches staged by people practicing passive resistance in the face of violence, then they aren't good protests. The narrative rests on four misconceptions: that the demonstrations from 1955 to 1968 were the first of their kind, that most Americans gave their support to the protests and their leaders, that they quickly exposed and vanquished hatred, and that they ended happily by bringing racial equality to America. This essay challenges that mythology. First, it chronicles a long civil rights movement from the 1890s to the 1950s that ultimately led to the classical phase of the movement. This longer look demonstrates that winning civil rights was much more difficult than most Americans believe, and that African Americans had always fought for equality. Second, it dispels the notion that most Americans supported the protests. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., who have been canonized in the past 35 years, were vilified then. Third, it proves that classical phase protests were, and had always been, about issues other than simply abolishing segregation. Police brutality, economic equity, voting rights, and cultural symbols have always been on the civil rights agenda. Fourth, it sees the classical phase as incomplete, with issues that remain on the national agenda. Reshaping the national myth of the good protest uncovers a more useful past in the face of growing anti-protest sentiment. The longer history of protests demonstrates that the years that it took for Black people to be able to sit where they liked on Montgomery buses or to order a grilled cheese sandwich at Greensboro's Woolworth lunch counter represented only a culmination of countless other protests that had preceded them. Those protests most often failed and were disorderly. People condemned them as lawless, and police brutally suppressed them. Homer Plessy and Rosa Parks both became famous for a day when they refused to participate in segregated transportation, but those refusals were separated by 63 years and 177 days, June 7, 1892 to December 1, 1955. As they began their commutes, both protesters anticipated what would happen. They expected that the driver would tell them to move, they knew they would refuse, and they braced themselves for what would follow. With organizational backing, they would fight the inevitable ejection, publicize it, and rally community protesters to support them. By the time that Parks refused to move to the back of the bus in 1955, countless others had followed Plessy's 1892 refusal to move to the Jim Crow trolley car, been arrested, and challenged the Jim Crow laws under which they were charged. Nonetheless, most Americans know Parks as the first person who challenged segregated transportation when she refused to move to the back of the bus and ignited more than a decade of novel civil rights actions in the 1950s and 1960s. As Blair L. M. Kelly documents, after the Plessy decision in 1896, cities and states across the South quickly passed public transportation segregation laws. In 1900, in Parks' home of Montgomery, Black residents responded to their city's passage of a segregation law with petitions, mass meetings, and a 2-year-long boycott and picketing. In 1903, the Montgomery City Council responded by passing a law prohibiting boycotting, picketing, or other interference with lawful business. That is the same law under which police arrested Parks. In 1955, a few Montgomery elders must have remembered the turn-of-the-century protests, even if Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. apparently remained unaware of them. Most historians also failed to connect them as part of a long history of protest. The streetcar demonstrations were not the only precedents on which the 1955 Montgomery marchers drew. In the 15 years before Parks's action, Black Southerners had launched almost daily protests against segregation on crowded buses and trains as the country mobilized on the home front for World War II. In Virginia, Polly Murray, a young Black woman, had been studying nonviolent techniques when she refused to stay seated in the back of a bus in 1940 in Petersburg, Virginia. After her arrest and conviction for disorderly conduct, she chose to go to jail rather than pay a fine. Moreover, Montgomery's bus boycotters would have known that during World War II in Birmingham, only 93 miles away, fights and arrests over seating on crowded buses had been commonplace. And in 1944 in Virginia, Irene Morgan refused to give up her bus seat, a refusal that the U.S. Supreme Court ratified when it found that forcing interstate passengers to abide by Virginia's segregation laws put an unconstitutional burden on interstate commerce. Nearly every iconic protest in the classical phase of the civil rights movement shared goals, venues, and methods with those that came before them. The first sit-in at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro in 1960 followed a formula that began over a quarter of a century earlier in Washington, D.C. There, a Black assistant to Representative Oscar DePriest, the nation's only Black congressman, was shocked on January 23, 1934, to find himself suddenly denied service at the Capitol's public restaurant, where he had customarily eaten over a 5-year period. Indeed, some 15 years earlier, Woodrow Wilson's administration had segregated the dining rooms on the Hill, but managers had enforced the rule only sporadically. Then managers manhandled and ultimately evicted a Black Chicago woman who was attending a congressional hearing. NAACP officials, students, and professors Ralph Bunche of Howard University and Howard Beale of the University of North Carolina, who was white, mounted sit-in demonstrations. Kenneth Clark, a 23-year-old Howard undergraduate, led 30 male Howard students in a sit-in at the House restaurant. A fracas, disorderly conduct charges, and threats of expulsion from Howard ensued. Representative DePriest worked to get a compromise behind the scenes, but he failed. Sporadic sit-ins on Capitol Hill continued for years. During World War II, Pauli Murray, by then a Howard University law student, led another sit-in movement in 1943 and 1944. Murray perfected the stool sitting technique, the method of nonviolent confrontation inside privately owned restaurants with robust picketing outside, all trademarks of the protesters from Greensboro's universities who took their own seats on Woolworth's lunch counter stools 17 years later. The national amnesia concerning early protests leaves most Americans with the impression that African Americans complied for decades with Jim Crow's outrages and theft of rights, even as it hides the continual remaking of the racist regime that whites built and rebuilt to enforce them during the decades that Jim Crow lasted. Moreover, the omission of protest history also makes it seem that when the evil of segregation became apparent to white people in 1955, the federal government quickly solved it with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That narrative allows space for redemption by implying that white people had been unaware of the extent of their own oppressive acts before the movement began. But the CRM's classical phase did not reveal previously hidden wrongs to an unaware white public. Instead, it initially cast those long visible wrongs in a new light for a small group of people who became allies. Finally, the horror and duration of those struggles unseated the national narrative of a progressive 20th century and placed responsibility for Black inequality not on faceless ancestral slaveholders, but on living white people's grandpas and grandmas. In the 1950s and 1960s, a vast majority of Americans condemned the civil rights protests. The notion that the movement won the mind of the nation at the time is fallacious. In 1966, even before urban riots, before the rise of Black power, only 36% of white people said that Martin Luther King Jr. was helping the cause, and 72% of white people had an unfavorable opinion of him. Moreover, most white people at the time were outraged at the protesters, not at the police, Birmingham Commissioner of Public Safety Eugene Bull Connor, or the violent white supremacist groups who beset demonstrators. In 1964, the year after Connor turned fire hoses and dogs on the crowds, he won election as president of the Alabama Public Service Commission. 2 years later, despite a decade of good protests and the Civil Rights Act, some 85% of white Americans and 30% of Black Americans thought that demonstrations by Negroes on civil rights hurt the advancement of that cause. Conservative and mainstream politicians smeared King as a communist throughout his career. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director J. Edgar Hoover testified to Congress that there was communistic influence infiltration in the civil rights movement. Mainstream columnist Joseph Alsop wrote in the Washington Post that King ignored FBI warnings about communists in the movement. As late as 1966, the FBI continued to pursue what it saw as communist activities within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Both King and Parks came under fire when they visited the Highlander Folk School, which white Southerners called a communist training school. It wasn't. Vilified at the time, King and Parks have become role models whom most Americans claim. In 2008, 11th and 12th graders, given complete latitude to include anyone, responded to the question, "Who are the most famous Americans?" by naming King and Parks in first and second place. Yet this celebration has come at the cost of obscuring what made them so controversial. With increasing intensity, conservatives have remade King into a caricature of his former self in an effort to hijack his legacy. It began in 1985, when Ronald Reagan argued that King would have opposed affirmative action. The truth is, quotas denied jobs to many who would have gotten them otherwise, but who weren't born a specified race or sex. That's discrimination pure and simple. Reagan then quoted King's "I Have a Dream" speech. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Nothing could be further from King's position than fabricating his opposition to affirmative action. In 1965, as President Lyndon Baines Johnson considered implementing affirmative action by executive order, writer Alex Haley asked King, "Do you feel it's fair to request a multi-billion-dollar program of preferential treatment for the Negro or for any other minority group?" King replied, "I do indeed. Can any fair-minded citizen deny that the Negro has been deprived?" Donald Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, used King's words to praise law enforcement's aggressive conduct against Black Lives Matter demonstrators. And I just want to leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that, "We must learn to live together as brothers or we will perish together as fools." She didn't quote another line from King. "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Collectively, the nation has rewritten support for the CRM and recast King's passive resistance as passivity. If the classical movement was roundly vilified at the time, it was in part because of its challenges to structural and systemic racism, the questioning of patriotic norms, and its calls to alleviate poverty. Protests from the mid-1950s until King's death were always about issues other than simply abolishing segregation. For example, fair economic policies always had a place in civil rights work. On the eve of World War II, Americans nervously awaited what promised to be the largest protest movement in the country's history, the original March on Washington movement, MOWM. Demanding jobs in defense industries and the federal government and desegregation of the armed forces, the MOWM became the quickest and most immediately successful protest movement that never happened. In the spring of 1941, officials in the Office of War Production tried to open jobs to African Americans with Eleanor Roosevelt's endorsement, but failed. Asa Philip Randolph, a powerful Black labor leader, realized that Negroes are not getting anywhere with national defense. In 3 months, he organized a movement that promised to bring 100,000 African Americans to Washington. He organized 36 MOWM chapters, including 10 in the South, held mass meetings, and worked through churches to get people to sign up for the march. In May, Randolph sent a manifesto to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the marchers' demands. The Black press ratcheted up the pressure with headlines such as, "Roosevelt gives only lip service to aid Negroes." In the weeks leading up to the scheduled march on July 1, 1941, demonstrators across the country carried signs such as, "Hitler must run this plant. They won't employ Negroes." Roosevelt responded that he could simply use his influence to promote hiring African Americans, but Randolph stuck to his demand of an executive order. Ultimately, Randolph won an incomplete victory, jobs, but not the desegregation of the military. Executive Order 8802, which FDR issued just 6 days before the scheduled march, banned discrimination in defense industries or government, and created a temporary committee on fair employment practices. Randolph called off the march. He kept the structure of the MOWM, and its followers continued during the war to protest discrimination when it occurred. Despite Randolph's success in ending discrimination in federal employment, the vast majority of the country remains segregated for another 20 years. When SCLC member and civil rights leader Ella Baker spoke to the founding conference of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, she said that students had already made it clear that the current sit-ins and other demonstrations are concerned with something much bigger than a hamburger. Instead, they are seeking to rid America of the scourge of racial segregation and discrimination, not only at lunch counters, but in every aspect of life. We will no longer accept the inferior position of second-class citizenship. Students, she continued, have a feeling that they have a destined date with freedom, not limited to a drive for personal freedom or even freedom for the Negro in the South. More than 60 years ago, in the middle of the classical phase of the civil rights movement, Baker declared war on structural racism, just as the Black Lives Matter movement has done. As protesters won victories for integration of public space in the 1960s, the movement and its leaders began to emphasize economic issues. In 1968, King organized the Poor People's Campaign, which, after his assassination, brought 50,000 multiracial protesters to camp in Resurrection City on the National Mall. His assassin acted, as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor reminds us, just after King called for a general strike during the 1968 Memphis Sanitation Workers Campaign. In the classical phase of the civil rights movement, leaders and participants also grappled with police brutality. In Letter from a Birmingham Jail, King addressed those who praised Bull Connor's forces for preventing violence. I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order if you had seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, nonviolent Negroes, or observed their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you would see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys. After King turned to the urban North in the final years of his life, he called on police to cease being occupation troops in the ghetto and start protecting residents. Despite honoring King, most Americans remain unaware that King protested issues that today might be considered outside of the model of the good protest. As Brandon M. Terry writes, canonization has prevented a reckoning with the substance of King's intellectual, ethical, and political commitments. The myth of the good protest excludes those who protest to question the inclusivity of national symbols in an effort to reform the country. But this also has a long history. In his 1935 Let America Be America Again, poet Langston Hughes wrote on the exclusion of African Americans from the polity. America never was America to me. Baseball hero Jackie Robinson wrote in his 1972 autobiography that, I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I am a black man in a white world. The irony was not lost on Colin Kaepernick, who tweeted those words on April 15, 2018. The narrative that the civil rights movement ended and ended well works to delegitimize the protest that followed it. Certainly, the classical phase protests did a great deal, but they failed to resolve the problem of racial inequality. Their successes did not herald the end of the struggle, but the beginning of a new struggle to enforce new laws and to apply those gains to everyday life. Alondra Nelson recently argued that there is a longue durée of Black Lives Matter. In fact, that movement follows on from the long history of protests outlined here. Yet, as protests took new forms, occurred in unfamiliar venues, and targeted systemic problems through complicated symbolism, many Americans discounted or even condemned them. In a Pew Research Center poll conducted in the last week of July and the first week of August 2020, alarming trends emerged. Some 40% of respondents doubted that people could count on their right to peacefully protest, up 13% from 2018. Even more troubling, 6 of every 10 people interviewed believed that the statement, "the rights and freedoms of all people are protected," did not accurately describe the situation in the country today. There were stark partisan divides in the responses. Some 80% of Republicans thought that the right to protest was safe, but only 43% of Democrats did. Astonishingly, just a bare majority of Republicans, 53%, said that it was highly important that protesters be able to peacefully assemble. Subsequently, the right to protest came under fire in 29 states. By July 2021, 8 states had passed laws cracking down on protest activity, and similar legislation was pending in 21 others. In Arkansas, you can be arrested for blocking a sidewalk and face a mandatory sentence of 30 days in jail. If you do it near critical infrastructure, you face 6 years in prison. In Florida, if your protest blocks traffic, even temporarily, the sentence could be 15 years in prison. In Oklahoma, if you stand on the street, making it unreasonably inconvenient for cars to pass, you could serve a year in prison. But if a driver unintentionally and exercising due care hits and kills you, he or she cannot be held civilly or criminally liable. The myth of the good protest has fostered a national belief that the purpose of the civil rights movement was to gain access to fora previously reserved for whites. When such access became legal, many Americans assumed that minorities had achieved equality, even as governmental and private institutions continued to privilege whites over minorities. The good civil rights movement had come and gone. Now African Americans were on their own. The classical phase of the civil rights movement was an extraordinary political era that toppled a legal regime that mandated racial oppression, but it fell short of achieving equality. But most white Americans believe that it settled things. A Gallup poll in 2008 revealed that nearly 90% of Americans believed that protesters in the civil rights movement had achieved some or all of their goals. The idea that the protests of the classical phase of the civil rights movement remade the United States into a colorblind country is one reason that by 2021, a majority of white Americans experienced no cognitive dissonance in believing that Rosa Parks' action to desegregate bus seating was right and just, but could not countenance the slogan, "Black Lives Matter," as a tool against structurally racist police violence. Or, instead of remembering African Americans' Depression-era boycotts in the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign, led by Black women practicing gendered consumer politics, they deplored boycotts as cancel culture. They condemned, rather than embraced, Colin Kaepernick's humble and harmless kneeling for the national anthem, a timeless religious gesture against oppression, in the tradition of King's own kneeling in 1965 in Selma, Alabama. Jean Theo Harris argues that the civil rights movement became a weapon some used against these new movements for justice, as comparison after comparison was made to the civil rights movement to find the BLM wanting. Many white Americans came to believe that it is acceptable to ask for admission to a system, but not to challenge its structure if it continues to disadvantage minorities. But by the late 2010s, protesters sought structural change. A deeply divided country began to speak 2 different languages. People of all ethnicities routinely use the terms systemic racism, racial capitalism, police violence, and carceral reform, but others spoke of snowflakes, socialism, cancel culture, Blue Lives Matter, and law and order. Nonetheless, some historians have found ways to honor the demonstrations of the classical phase of the civil rights movement without drawing vast divides among them, their antecedents, and those that followed them. They recognize that the myth of the mid-20th century model works to foreclose possibilities for recognizing current demonstrations as a civil rights movement. The tendency to condemn all demonstrations as lawless gained speed in the 2020 presidential election. That summer, Trump and Republican allies mounted a law and order campaign that painted national protests against police brutality as un-American, violent, anarchist, and the Democrats' fault. Heather Cox Richardson documented 89 tweets by Trump in a single evening, most of them condemning protesters, including his retweet of One American News claiming that it appears this coup attempt is led by a well-funded network of anarchists trying to take down the president. As journalist Charles P. Pierce asked of Trump's fantasy of thugs on planes headed to demonstrations, isn't this pretty much the same thing as the busloads of armed blacks that we heard about during every urban disturbance in the 1960s? Change is possible, but painfully hard. Democratic progress arises from group actions that may be messy and flawed. Civic problems run deeper than any single protest can possibly solve. Protests rarely succeed in isolation. Instead, they succeed when they open up new ways to express citizenship rights and slowly erode structural inequities. More than most Americans believe or are willing to accept, radical ideas and actors often accompany more mainstream protests and help extend the limits of possibility closer to equality for all. Even the most successful protest is only a partial victory, a prelude to the hard work that follows to change hearts, minds, and laws, and to root out systems of oppression. Nonetheless, there is some evidence that recent protests worked. In the midst of the Republican attacks on protests in September 2020, a Washington Post poll offered a glimpse of Americans coming to terms with the protests of the recent past. Some 63% of Americans, 73% of Democrats, and 36% of Republicans support athletes speaking out and say anthem protests are appropriate. Minds change, and society and institutions change with them. Kenneth Clark, the Howard student who organized the 1934 Capitol Hill sit-ins, found himself a victim of tactics similar to those Trump used on Black Lives Matter. His future at risk, Clark held his ground. I have no apologies to make for participating in the protest of such an ungodly crime, and if my participation places me in the category of a hoodlum, I am proud to be one. If seeking our rights as American citizens makes us communists, then I am also proud to be among the ranks of communists. Clark wasn't a communist any more than the vast majority of today's protesters are anarchists. 20 years later, psychologist Kenneth Clark's joint research with his wife, Mamie Clark, demonstrated the pernicious effects of racism and proved instrumental in changing the minds of the Supreme Court justices who determined Brown versus Board of Education.